Hello, my name is Pete Farnham. I'm a friend of your professor, Paul St. Clair, and I'm also a Vietnam veteran. And he asked me to give a brief talk about my experiences in Vietnam for your history class. And I'm happy to do that. And Paul, I want to thank you for inviting me to talk. And I hope students, what I have to say is interesting and useful to you. It was over 50 years ago that I was there, but the memories are still firm, and it's far enough back now that we have some perspective on it. Before I get talking about my experiences in the war, I want to give you a little background. Well, I joined the Army 3 months out of high school on September 26, 1967. It's important to take a minute here to talk about what was going on outside the bubble of Army life in which I found myself for the next 3 years. Momentous events were going on in America, but I was so insulated that most of them passed me by, and I have only the vaguest recollection of most of them in real time. Now, keep in mind, this was 30 years before the internet and cell phones, and during training especially, we had very little access to TV, radio, or newspapers. As I write this, I'm really kind of astounded how uninformed we all were. Well, at least I was. A few examples. On October 21st, 1967, I'd been in the Army about 3 weeks. The first huge anti war demonstration took place, the so called March on the Pentagon. My parents lived about 5 miles from the Pentagon, so you'd think I'd have had some interest in it, and I might have had I known anything about it. But it wasn't until years later that I learned about it when I read Norman Mailer's book, The Armies of the Night, an excellent look at the anti war movement and the protest movement of the late and the protest culture of the late 60s. If you can find it, it's well worth the read. On January 31st, 1968, North Vietnam launched the Tet Offensive, which was a terrible military defeat for them. The Viet Cong, which were the indigenous South Vietnamese guerrilla fighters, was destroyed as a military force after this. But it was also a major psychological defeat for the U.S. As it destroyed the optimism about the war that had been the official line from the Pentagon and the Johnson White House. I was in advanced infantry training at the time and had only the vaguest notion that this was going on. The Tet Offensive also led to political disaster for Johnson when on March 12th, peace candidate Eugene McCarthy almost defeated him, a sitting president of his own party, in the New Hampshire Democratic primary. Well, this is a wake-up call for Johnson, and it caused him to announce on March 31st that he had decided not to seek re-election, throwing the Democratic Party into considerable disarray. I was, once again, pretty much clueless about any of this. 4 days later, on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, sparking widespread and justifiable rage in the African American community, as well as what has been called the greatest level of unrest in the U.S. since the Civil War. We were aware of this event, of course. King was so well known that even lonely infantry trainees like me knew who he was. However, the only repercussion for us was that weekend passes were canceled due to fear of rioting in downtown Columbus. Then on June 5th, Senator Robert Kennedy, brother of the assassinated President John F. Kennedy, was himself assassinated in Los Angeles, California, having just won the California Democratic primary. Two assassinations of top political figures in the U.S. Within 2 months was a devastating blow to the country's confidence and belief in itself, and a clear sign that all was not right with our republic. Since Bobby was the front runner for the Democratic Party nomination for president in 1968, his assassination led to the selection of Hubert Humphrey, LBJ's vice president, as the party's candidate. Well, the convention took place in Chicago starting August 26th. The convention is more remembered, however, as the scene of massive anti-war protests and a so-called police riot when hundreds of Chicago police officers went rogue, took off their badges, and began beating protesters and engaging in other heinous illegal activity. The rioting led to the notorious Chicago 7 trial, and the story of which is being shown on Netflix these days, starring none other than Sacha Baron Cohen. Yes, that's Sacha Baron Cohen, as Abbie Hoffman, one of the leaders of the Chicago protests. Richard Nixon was elected president on November 5th, basically on the strength of his, quote, secret plan to end the war. Troops began coming home 6 months after he took office, with the first ground troops leaving on July 8, 1969. The first half of 1969 was relatively quiet, well, in comparison to the previous year. However, on July 20th, the Apollo 11 mission landed men on the moon, a monumental event which I did not witness being in Vietnam at the time. On the cultural front, the legendary Woodstock Music Festival took place in upstate New York from August 15th to the 18th. And I was also in Vietnam then, within a couple months of coming home. I do remember reading an article about it in the Stars and Stripes, the U.S. military newspaper. A few months later, on December 6th, the Aquarian Age came to an abrupt end with the Altamont Music Festival held outside San Francisco, California, and featuring the Rolling Stones and other top acts at the time. The film Gimme Shelter captures on camera the murder of a spectator 20 feet from the stage during the Stones' performance. May 4th, 1970 rounded out a terrible period in U.S. history with the massacre at Kent State University in Kent, Ohio, of 4 students protesting the U.S. incursion into Cambodia, which was widely viewed as an expansion of the Vietnam War. Poorly trained and led Ohio National Guardsmen were called in to restore order and were inexplicably issued live ammunition. So, as you can see, this is a very tumultuous period in U.S. history. Well, that's the backdrop of what was going on during my years in the Army. I was, in fact, lucky to have received a year's worth of training. Most draftees went through basic training, then about 10 weeks of infantry training, then received a brief leave of 2 to 3 weeks, then went to Vietnam for a year. I went through all that, but I also received 6 months of training as a sergeant by having been selected to go to NCO school at Fort Benning. I also went to airborne training, so having joined the Army on September 26, 1967, it wasn't until October 4th, 1968, that I actually arrived in country. I was assigned to the 1st Infantry Division, the famed Big Red One, as it was called in the Army. I arrived at Quan Loy, one of the division base camps, a few days after landing in country, and was assigned to D Company, 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry Regiment. Quan Loy was a dirt airfield hacked out of a few thousand acres of rubber trees, surrounded by tents, a few permanent buildings, and barbed wire, about 50 miles north of Saigon on Highway 13. The base camp was just north of An Loc, the northernmost major town before the Cambodian border, about 20 miles further north. I spent my first week in Jungle Devil School, a training course to familiarize new infantrymen with division tactics and life in the field in an infantry unit. I expected to join my company in the field within a day or two of completing this course, but one morning fate intervened in the form of having just changed my uniform after taking a shower. Another sergeant and I were called to the company headquarters, and the sergeant in charge looked at us and nodded at me. He says, "Hugo, you're the cleanest." I was told to report to battalion headquarters. I spent the next 6 weeks helping train a group of about 100 Cambodian irregulars who had been fighting for the North Vietnamese, but then defected as a unit when the North Vietnamese imprisoned Crown Prince Sihanouk, Cambodia's head of state, and these men were very loyal to the prince. My job was to teach them a little English, as well as to get to know well a group of about 10 of them who were going to be assigned to my company as scouts. Due to this unexpected duty, I didn't join my unit in the field until mid-November. This is the first of many Army experiences that taught me that sometimes the smallest, most random event, in this case having just showered and changed, can have unforeseen circumstances. Well, the next 9 months all kind of blend together. In the field, you quickly lose track of what day of the week it is, for example. However, we all knew exactly how many days we had left in our tour. Army tours are exactly a year long. Thus, I arrived in country on October 4th, 1968, and thus knew I would go back to the world. The world is what we called the United States on October 4th, October 3rd, 1969. Well, a typical day in the field would involve everyone waking up at about 6 a.m. That would be 0600 in military parlance. A fighting position would usually have 3 men in it, and the men would take turns eating and cleaning weapons, taking care to always have 1 man on guard. Once everyone was ready, we would usually be on the move by 0800 or so. A typical patrol might cover anywhere from 5 to 10 kilometers. We called a kilometer a click, so it would be a 5-click patrol. It would be 5 kilometers. Over the course of the day, a mission might be a reconnaissance in force, where you go out looking for contact with any enemy units known to be in the area, or bomb damage assessment. A unit would always have to go and inspect bomb damage from B-52 strikes. Sometimes we would come to a trail that wasn't marked on our maps, and we would follow it to see where it led, and also to survey it so the next edition of the map would be updated. Navigation was by compass, pace count, and highly detailed maps. You would keep a pace count to be able to tell how far you'd gone. My pace was 117 steps per 100 meters. I got quite good at land navigation over my year in Vietnam, and it's a skill that I have retained. We were usually patrolling in heavy jungle and deep shade, although we'd often come to clearings, either rice fields surrounding abandoned villages or just natural savanna in the woods. We spent a lot of time patrolling in rubber plantations as well. That was a major agricultural crop in this part of Vietnam. Stream crossings were frequent, and sometimes, if the stream was clear and flowing nicely, and we had been in the field for more than a day or two, we would stop and set up a perimeter and have the men take turns washing up. We also had water purification tablets, and a nice clear stream would allow us to top off our canteens. Well, I don't recall ever getting sick from drinking water from such a stream. We'd stop for lunch usually midday, set up a perimeter, and eat sea rations. Each man usually carried 3 days' worth of food. Some units issued rucksacks to the troops. Our unit, however, did not. Instead, we carried our cans in army socks that would used as bags tied to our other gear, or we put the cans in our cargo pockets. A typical grunt would carry an M16 rifle and 20 magazines of ammunition, each magazine holding 18 rounds apiece. He would also carry 2 hand grenades and a claymore mine. 3 cans of water was pretty standard for most soldiers, as well as 3 days' worth of food. A sterile bandage, an entrenching tool, a gas mask, flashlight, a toothbrush, a poncho liner, which is a lightweight blanket, a few personal items, and a towel completed our equipment. Most of us did not carry a poncho. If it rained, you just got wet. Clothing was always jungle boots, no socks, a set of jungle fatigues, and no underwear. Just got wet, and it would stay wet because it wasn't under your outside clothes, and it would chafe and be really uncomfortable. And in our case, we also wore a black scarf, which was the emblem of our battalion. Well, I still have mine more than 50 years later, and here it is. This is my black scarf. You see the 1 and the 2 there. That's 1st Battalion, 2nd Infantry. The color green indicates that that was from a D Company scarf. Each company had a different color number on the back of the scarf. We would stop for the day usually about 4 p.m. and set up a perimeter. And each squad was responsible for 2 foxholes, and usually it was 3 men per foxhole. We would dig a fighting position, piling the dirt up in front of it and reinforcing it with logs or other material available. We would then cook dinner, heating up cans of sea rations over small pieces of C4, a flammable plastic explosive, make coffee, clean weapons and shifts, perhaps write a letter or play cards, and generally relax until dark. Of course, always making sure our weapons were handy and someone from each squad was on guard. Once our company commander said, "Damn, I could use a beer. Who wants a beer?" And then in about 45 minutes, a chopper arrived with a couple of duffel bags filled with ice-down beer. It was a welcome respite from the monotony. Watch would start at 9 p.m. or 2100. We would pull 90-minute shifts twice a night. It was very difficult staying awake after days in the field, so the command post would call every hole every 15 minutes to make sure we were awake. At night, every platoon would also have a listening post called an LP outside the perimeter, maybe 25 meters out. This was 3 men who would be responsible for giving early warning in case of attack. It was a particularly scary duty, so our practice was to put a new guy out on LP his first night in the field, sort of pushing him into the deep end, of course, with 2 experienced men. Occasionally, rather than setting up a perimeter, we would set up an ambush along a trail, hoping to catch some North Vietnamese moving after dark. A watch would end at 0600 the next morning, and then the whole process I just talked about would repeat itself for the next day. Well, I don't have a whole lot of war stories to tell. I saw my share of combat in Vietnam, but never was engaged in a massive ground attack like you perhaps have seen in some of the movies about Vietnam, such as We Were Soldiers Once and Young, Hamburger Hill, or Oliver Stone's slanderous film Platoon. The first time I was under fire was in late November 1968. My platoon had point that day, and I was walking on point in the left file. We came to a large stand of bamboo, and the right file went around the right side, and I led the left file around the left. Then I heard a sound like firecrackers going off, pop, 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 and thought for a second that someone must have accidentally fired their rifle. Then it dawned on me that we were being shot at. I don't remember actually hitting the ground. The next thing I remember is being prone, staring at a bug crawling an inch or so in front of my nose. Well, all hell broke loose, and we laid down to base a fire and extracted my friend who had been shot as he went around the right side of the stand of bamboo. The last I saw of him, he was being carried in a poncho liner out to a helicopter that had been called in to evacuate him to the rear. He was pretty badly wounded. He wasn't walking and wasn't even moving, but the medic told us he was alive when he was placed on the chopper. That was a good sign. If you got evacuated alive, your chances of surviving were very good. The medical care in Vietnam was excellent, and thousands of men survived who would have died in World War II or Korea. This is another example of how the tiniest twist of fate can have a major impact on your life. Had I been leading the right file instead of the left, it would have been me that had been wounded. I didn't think about this too much at the time, and only in later years, when I sometimes can't sleep, do I think about it. The worst night I spent in Vietnam was in March 1969 and didn't involve me getting shot at personally. The company had set up 3 ambush sites along a canal in the rice paddy country a few miles south of Saigon. Our 3rd platoon had set up in the same spot the night before and set up here again on inexplicable orders of the battalion commander. This is something you never did, set up 2 nights in a row in the same place. My platoon was set up about 500 yards down the canal, occupying some rice paddy dikes. There was barely room for us to set up, and it was only the cover of darkness that gave us any protection. Well, during the night, we got notified that 3rd platoon had been ambushed, and there were lots of casualties, so we went on 100% alert the rest of the night. It was just as well. I'd had rats crawling over me during the night, as the dike was the only dry spot for dozens of meters in every direction, and the rats needed dry ground as well. But I was too tired and inured to misery as a grunt to care. It is amazing what you get used to. Well, in any case, 3rd platoon was almost completely wiped out, with 9 killed and 12 wounded. Only 5 or 6 men escaped unscathed, including a friend of mine from NCO school back at Fort Benning. Well, I managed to escape field duty for a brief respite when I went to Australia on R&R for a week in June 1969. I enjoyed Sydney very much and hope to go back someday. I returned, and about 6 weeks later ended up in a rear area job where I spent my last 6 weeks in country. I also caught malaria and came down with an attack while processing out of the division to return home. I went to the hospital with a fever of 106.8 and, of course, was given ice baths and other treatment until it stabilized. I ended up leaving only 1 day late due to the kindness of a doctor who was from the Washington, D.C. area, and I promised him I'd call his family when I got home, which I did. Well, war to me was almost entirely dirt, boredom, and exhaustion, punctuated by moments of serious fear. Fortunately, training and pride allowed you to cope with this and still function. Well, no one fought for country or God or to defeat communism. We fought ultimately for each other. Well, I think I'll stop there. For further reading, I recommend The Pentagon Papers, a collection of government documents showing how we became mired in this basically feudal war. I also recommend A Bright Shining Lie by Neil Sheehan, the New York Times correspondent whose book largely informed the recent Ken Burns documentary series about Vietnam, also worth watching. Michael Hare's book Dispatches captures the craziness of war and the strange, almost surreal humor that infantrymen engage in. A good novel about the war is Fields of Fire by James Webb, who was a Marine platoon leader and later a U.S. Senator from Virginia. I also recommend They Marched into Sunlight by David Moranis, We Were Soldiers Once and Young by Hal Moore and Joseph Galloway, and finally Hamburger Hill by Samuel Zafiri, my personal favorite of the histories I've read of particular campaigns. If there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them if you'd care to send them to me through your professor. Well, thanks for the opportunity, Paul, to talk about this difficult subject, and thank you all for listening. Hope you have a great day.